All right, emergency podcast. Mason Choate and Andrew Hutchinson from HawgBeat.com along with you. Arkansas gets two big commitments over the weekend. Now, before we get started, I do want to ask if you like what you see, give us a thumbs up, subscribe to the YouTube. That always helps us out. So please do that. It's not that hard to hit a thumbs up if you like it. If you don't like it, don't hit it. That's fine. But we'll get along with what we're gonna do. So Hutch, Arkansas, two big commitments, much needed. Drew Sanders, linebacker from Alabama, and then Dwight McGlothern, cornerback from LSU. So I always do this, just initial reaction. Andrew Hutchinson, you're the expert. Tell us what you think.
Yeah, two massive pickups. Once again, Arkansas had already gotten Jaden Hazelwood and Landon Jackson back during the early signing period from the portal. And now they go out and get two four-star recruits. I know some people have referred to Drew Sanders as a five-star, but on Rivals, he was just a high four-star, 6.0 four-star, number 37 overall recruit in his class. Went to Alabama, and this isn't one of those guys that went to Alabama and just was a total bust and is now trying to go somewhere smaller where he can play. I've talked to some Alabama people, and they really liked his talent. They really like his athleticism, what he brings to the table as a pass rusher. But unfortunately, he got put behind another guy who just happens to possibly be a first-round pick eventually. So it's a win-win for everybody. He's got to get to go somewhere where he can hopefully play. Arkansas is going to get a player at a position of need at linebacker. They need somebody to play alongside Bumper Pool. That's obviously huge news that he's coming back for a super senior season, but you can't play with one linebacker. I guess they could try. You need two. You don't really have a whole lot of experience outside of Bumper Pool. So that one is a massive, massive get for Arkansas. Plus, he might give you a pass rusher, which you need someone to rush the passer, whether it be a defensive end, linebacker. And he seems to be a guy that can fit that requirement. So as far as Dwight McGlothern, he's a guy that signed with LSU out of high school. Really talented four-star kid, top 150 recruit. And he even started 6 games this year as a sophomore at LSU. And LSU has a lot of talent in the secondary. So that tells you how good he is. Not only that he signed with LSU, but also started early in his career. Had some good games, graded out okay on Pro Football Focus as a young guy. You think that Arkansas will need some secondary help. You lose Joe Fouché and Greg Brooks, who, ironically enough, go to LSU. You also lose Monteric Brown to the NFL draft. You do have Ladarius Bishop coming back. You do have Hudson Clark coming back. You have some other young pieces. But if you can get a guy that has SEC starting experience to come in and be able to kind of help that along, then you got 3 guys you feel comfortable with playing corner. That's a massive get for Arkansas in a position that we had identified previously on the podcast that was an area that they needed to go get. So really solid day, big day for Arkansas in the transfer portal to land those 2 guys and give them 4 big-time players at positions of need out of the portal.
So you kind of mentioned it with Joe Fouché and Greg Brooks going to LSU, but now Arkansas has 2 former LSU Tigers that they've gotten to come to Fayetteville, and that is McGlothern and then the D lineman, his name's slipping my mind, Landon Jackson. Okay, so I want to ask you this. So Fouché and Brooks go to LSU. McGlothern comes to Arkansas. Do you think Arkansas is getting the better end of the deal, or is that kind of to be seen?
Obviously, we'll have to see how the season plays out. But if you look at it, LSU's probably getting the more proven commodities. That we know what Greg Brooks, we know what Joe Fouché can do in the SEC, whereas Arkansas is getting the more, there's higher potential, higher ceiling, in my opinion, with what Arkansas got. McGlothern, as I said, has already started like 6 games, but he's just a sophomore. Throw in the COVID year, he's still got 3 years to play. You throw in Landon Jackson, he's still got 3 years to play. So it's a really good situation for Arkansas if those guys pan out. And I think most people are really high on those guys. Landon Jackson, he ended up not in the Rivals 250, but that's because he had a serious injury as a senior in high school. That's also what kind of limited him this year as a true freshman. And, he was a top 100 recruit back, whenever Arkansas was recruiting him out of Texarkana. So really talented guys. I think the ceiling is much higher, but I think the floor for Greg Brooks and Joe Fouché is much higher than what it is for Arkansas's two transfers, just because, they are proven guys. And really, Joe Fouché is definitely only 1 year guy for LSU. I mean, he's only got 1 year left. Greg Brooks could be 2 years. I think he's probably got his sights set on being there for just 1 year and then going to the NFL draft. But both those guys have deficiencies in their game that we're not 100% sure they'll be able to improve. I mean, Joe Fouché is a really physical safety who can come down and pop you, but he sometimes has lapses in coverage. Greg Brooks is kind of the reverse. I mean, he's a really good cover guy. He played the nickel spot for Arkansas, 3-year starter, but he is not a physical guy. He shies away from contact, misses tackles quite frequently. So, I mean, he's still a solid player, and he's improved each year, and there's reason to believe he'll continue to improve. But we've seen a larger frame of work and know that that's probably not something that's going to become like drastically better where they could be first round draft picks. Whereas Arkansas, the two guys they got, McGlothern and Landon Jackson, we haven't seen enough of them to really know, okay, is this guy going to actually pan out, or is he going to be a bust? Whatever. The ceiling is really, really high, as I was saying, and I think that the potential is there for those guys to be really good. And Arkansas could be viewed, let's say we're talking 3 years from now, we could be looking back and saying, man, Arkansas really, really won that trade-off.
So if you look at it now with the transfer commitments that Arkansas has, you add on Jaden Hazelwood from Oklahoma. Sam Pittman has worked this portal really well. It's not a high volume, but what you're getting is a lot of talent, and some guys that prove themselves in high school, but just have to do more of it in college. So he's working this portal really well. You think maybe he might be talking to Eric Musselman, and some people think that Eric Musselman didn't work the portal well this year, but that is to be seen. But I want to ask you this, Hutch. So Drew Sanders from Alabama, according to your story, he was the number 37 overall recruit in the class of 2020. And I mean, he had some big time offers. I mean, you talk about Alabama where he went, but I mean, you're looking at Georgia, LSU, Notre Dame, Oklahoma, Texas, USC. These are the top tier programs in the country. And now he's at Arkansas. And do you think that maybe the Hogs going to Tuscaloosa this year and playing very competitive, do you think that maybe that really helped with the recruitment of Sanders, because he's like, okay, maybe Arkansas is a legit program now with Sam Pittman there?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's definitely had to help. And you're not just beating out those schools, from who recruited him out of high school, but I mean, he was looking at Oklahoma and Texas out of the portal, and so he could have easily gone to one of those programs, but he picked Arkansas, and so you like to think that the showing they had in Tuscaloosa, probably helped. You have to think that the fact that really they only have one linebacker returning in Bumper Pool that is basically locked in as a starter, so you've got playing time opportunity. Plus, one other thing that I think really helped Drew Sanders, and I don't know if it really has gotten much attention, is that based on everything I've read, Drew Sanders is a very quiet guy. He doesn't really talk a whole lot, doesn't really talk to the media, doesn't do interviews. He's retweeted some stuff on Twitter, but if you go back, I don't know if he's actually tweeted before his announcement that he's coming to Arkansas in like 2 or 3 years. So he's not your typical college age kid who's all over social media and like, hey, look at me, I want NIL deals, yada yada yada. He really is kind of a quiet guy, very similar, in my opinion, to kind of the personalities of Sam Pittman and Barry Odom. I mean, these are two guys that are not huge social media guys. Sam Pittman does it because he's basically required to as the head coach of an SEC program, and you've got to stay up to date with all the other recruits you're after. Barry Odom, I mean, he has a Twitter, but he's not really super active on it. So I mean, I think that really kind of had an impact for him as well, as just kind of the personality match there really fit, plus the playing time, and plus he got to see firsthand what Arkansas has and kind of what they're building when Arkansas went there and played really well in Tuscaloosa.
All right, so a guy that we haven't mentioned yet, that because he didn't commit to Arkansas, is Jaxon Player, the defensive tackle out of Tulsa. So that's the position of need now that you're looking at, and you're like, this is the position that Arkansas needs to address. There's one guy from Missouri, Wingo, who they've targeted, but we don't know how we feel about that. So first of all, before we get to that, just reaction to Jaxon Player. He committed to Baylor. I feel like a lot of people thought he was coming to Arkansas. So just kind of talk about how that played out.
Yeah, I mean, I had a story ready to go, ready to publish for whenever he committed to Arkansas. I think the coaching staff thought they were confident they were going to get him. This is a guy that was a two-time all-conference performer at Tulsa. That's the American Athletic Conference, the same conference as Houston, Cincinnati, really good football conference. So he was a proven commodity. There were some, slight concerns on his size. I mean, he's listed as 6 foot tall. That might be a little generous, but still, he has proven, over the last 4 years to be a really good player. He was coached by Jamil Ashley, Arkansas's defensive line coach, for the first 3 years he was at Tulsa. He was recruited by Coach Ashley. I mean, this guy was a unheralded 3-star recruit that, I think he didn't have any Power 5 offers, and I think he picked picked Tulsa over offers from like some FCS schools and some other, smaller group of 5 schools. So he didn't really, have a lot of attention, and he really, has a relationship with Coach Ashley. And so I think Arkansas fans, Arkansas coaches really felt they were in good position. Ended up going to Baylor instead. However, I guess if you really look at it, it makes sense. I mean, he's from Waco, and I think he said he grew up like 8 minutes away from Baylor's campus. That's got to count for something. I mean, you look back at some guys that transferred, to be close to home, and you want all these guys at Fayetteville High School to come to Arkansas because they're right here by University of Arkansas campus. I mean, that's why Isaiah Sategna was such a huge commitment in 2022. So you get it, you understand it, but it does suck for Arkansas because, as you said, it's a big position of need, and now you have to look elsewhere. Like, okay, what are we going to get? Because they've obviously identified defensive tackle as an area of need. I mean, you're losing John Ridgeway to the NFL draft. You're losing Markel Utze to just graduation, being out of eligibility. You do have a couple of guys like Isaiah Nichols, Torian Carter. Those guys are coming back. They really like what they have in Cam Ball, but he was just a true freshman this year. But they still feel like they need some more depth at that position. And I agree. You can't just have those 3 guys that I mentioned. You're going to need a transfer or 2 to help you give you some depth there in the middle of your defensive line.
Well, before we wrap up, according to you, Arkansas now has 3 remaining spots, assuming Miles Rouser commits. And you think that those are all going to be used on transfers. So any idea on who they might get? I know there's not a lot of confidence right now in anybody, but you're the insider. Tell us what you know.
Yeah, 3 spots, assuming Rouser signs in February. And I would imagine one of those is going to go to a defensive tackle. You mentioned Mekhi Wingo from Missouri would be a massive get. SEC all-freshman team this year. So he's young and talented. Probably going to go to LSU. That's where his high school coach is now an assistant coach. Plus, he also has visited USC. He may get awed by the Los Angeles kind of situation out there. I mean, that may be a big one for him. And then as far as other guys, there's a couple of defensive tackles I wouldn't be surprised they went and targeted. There was one that just went in the portal from Auburn recently. It was a highly recruited guy that was just a true freshman this year. There's an older guy from Miami they could target. But then that's just one spot. Maybe they try to go get 2, but I would imagine they go get another defensive back. I know Georgia has had a few defensive backs go in the portal, and there's obviously the connection with Sam Pittman coming from Georgia. He's got a really good relationship with Kirby Smart. Maybe that could come to fruition with something. And then, if they get 1 defensive tackle, 1 defensive back, then that leaves you with 1 kind of wild card spot. Maybe they hold it for after spring ball and see who else enters the portal, and you just go get the best player available, regardless of position. Maybe they still try to go add a quarterback, because they do, even with Hornsby coming back out of the portal, you've still got, just the 3 guys that are healthy with Renfro recovering from ACL surgery. So maybe they try to go add a quarterback. Maybe they go add another playmaker at wide receiver if you can find a really good one. That's kind of the wild card spot, and how I would imagine them playing it out is defensive tackle, defensive back, and then maybe best available after spring ball.
All right, well, that's going to wrap us up for this emergency podcast. So Arkansas gets commitments from Drew Sanders and Dwight McGlothern. If you like what you saw, give it a thumbs up, hit the subscribe button, and go subscribe to HawgBeat.com. Best Arkansas athletics content anywhere, best you can get. Andrew Hutchinson, best in the business. But thank you guys for watching, and we'll talk to you soon.